Hey, what is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Glad to be with you today. Actually had an opportunity to be able to put together a second video this week. And really, it was out of some feedback that I got from my first video this week, which I put out entitled What Should Be Done. And in that video, I addressed what I believe needs to be done in regards to the fight that we find ourselves in terms of trying to reshape education. As most of you guys know, things have been at a fever pitch here recently with parents pushing back against things that are going on inside of school systems across America, but specifically here in our state, which we're focused on in the state of Indiana. We've seen things related to mask mandates and COVID policies, quarantines, things of that nature, social emotional learning curriculum that parents have, come to understand, along with critical race theory, and how that stuff is being embedded into curriculum as well. And so, again, things are kind of white hot right now in terms of parent involvement. And sometimes we see that manifesting itself into a way that isn't productive. It certainly, we've seen scenes at least of some nasty exchanges at school board meetings and in communities and things of that nature. And I think if our true intention is to create change, we need to make sure that we're focusing our efforts in the right way. And as I said in my video earlier this week, I certainly applaud those who are, pushing the narrative, who are trying to get the message out there, who are going to school board meetings. And I certainly hope that we continue to see that engagement, that those school board meetings should be held for the community and for the community to be able to express their opinions about things and also learn from members of the school system about what is going on inside their communities. And so that is all a very important part of this. But really what I came away with trying to advocate for in that video, what should be done, is to say we need to kind of reassess our goals here, right? What are we doing? What are we hoping to accomplish by showing up and doing those things? Are we doing it in a therapeutic way where we take a principled stand and we feel good about that? We're standing on our foundation and we're trying to hold people accountable, and we're thumping our chests and we're flexing our muscles and we're saying, this is how it should be. You're accountable to us, on and on and on. But then at the end of the day, what's happening, right? If all that's happening is, the process of going through that, but then weeks and months go by and things are still the same way, has anything really constructive gone on? Yes, you've participated, and that is a very important aspect, and we want that, engagement. But if we're trying to move the needle, if our goal is to try to reform and reshape, what is happening related to curriculum or mask mandates and COVID policies and things of that nature, are we really getting anything done? And I argued in that first video that I don't think we are, and I don't think we ever will, because as I said, you're fighting against a machine, a well-oiled, well-funded machine that has centuries worth of, entrenchment in it, and it's not going to change very easily. Now, again, that's not to say it can't happen, and it doesn't. There aren't small victories. We've definitely seen that from time to time, but we certainly get situations too where a lot of times people do things and then nothing really changes. So I thought, after creating, what should be done, I got some feedback, and it really led me to think about this idea of how it should be done. Some people said in the comment sections to the videos that I posted, this sounds great. How do we do this? How do we go about bringing about change? And again, I want to be clear in saying that I always advocate for freedom to choose. And I was very clear in my first video, and I maintain that clarity here in saying that if the local public school works for you, great, so be it. But the default position, I argue, shouldn't be that. We shouldn't automatically default to thinking like that's what the normal experience should look like, and that everybody should be, directed into that. and that anything beyond that should take extra work or be viewed as outside the norm, or whatever stigma comes along with attempting to educate a child outside of the confines of the public school building. And so, defenders of public schools will say, well, there already is choice. There already is the option of homeschool and charter schools and so on and so forth. And they're true to an extent, but, it's kind of like, when you go to order something off of a menu and, you tell the person what you want and they say, okay, is that all? And you're like, well, can I get this? Oh yeah, you can get that. Or you find out later on that you had all these other options that were available, but they weren't forthcoming about that, right? And that's really what it's like in education. The public schools aren't exactly going to stand up and get out the megaphone or the bullhorn and say, hey, did you know you can withdraw your child from public school? That's not going to happen. And I hear stories all the time about how people have struggles with their local schools in terms of withdrawing their children and going to an alternative. So again, I say all that to say that the default should be, it's wide open. There should be no, standard of, well, it's going to be done this way unless you put on all this extra effort and work. And, on top of that, the way the system is set up right now, it makes it extremely difficult for some people to be able to participate in those alternatives. They feel anchored and attached and stuck with the local school that they have. Again, I mentioned in another video, watch the movie Waiting for Superman, and you'll see what I'm talking about in terms of people who are out there clamoring for an alternative, but the system isn't set up that they have the opportunity to participate in those things. And that's a lot of urban, by the way, and as I mentioned in the last video, there are rural obstacles to overcome where if you're in, probably 75 to 80% of counties in Indiana, you have no alternative choices in your area or very few viable options there. And it's time for that to change. It's time for us to say, hey, if we live in a, county or a community where there isn't currently a lot of options, what can we do to make that happen? And that's where I want to kind of focus in on this, how it should be done. So the first thing I would say is it's going to take community-wide engagement. And we have to be willing to come to the table knowing that there are going to be different voices at that table, knowing that people are going to have different agendas, knowing that people are going to want to see different things done. And so long as there can be agreement, or maybe not, maybe at the end of the day, you come together and you end up forming multiple different options. Whether that's like, for example, religious versus non-religious, that's like the easiest thing that I can think of, right? When you're talking about alternatives to schools and you're looking at setting up, like co-ops, for example, or learning pods, or whatever you want to call them nowadays. That maybe there are instances where, that's one of the first things that gets talked about. Is this going to be secular? Is it going to be religious? And so maybe there's a certain, portion of the community that wants, more of a secular based learning experience. And so if there's enough interest in that they could go off and do that. And then maybe if there's enough interest from a religious, whether that's Christian or multi-denominational, approach, that could happen as well. You have to think about thresholds. You have to think about what will work in terms of things like logistics, numbers, facilities to meet at, securing curriculum, securing instructors. Those are the kinds of planning meetings that have to happen, right? And those can happen in a very real and laid back sense. Meet at a local coffee shop, meet at a local library, meet in people's homes, find out what resources are available or are at your disposal and be creative with that. I kind of went through that prior to the pandemic setting in. I had signed on to help out with an upstart company that was looking at creating learning pods, coincidentally enough, prior to COVID. And it made it extremely difficult once, COVID set in, to bring families together when we were being told to stay apart from each other, and it kind of fell by the wayside. But those kinds of things are starting to thrive now in communities. And so those are the first steps that you need to look at in terms of that logistics planning, finding out what interest there is in your community, finding out what the threshold would be for, numbers of people that you would need to start. And you can start small. If you can find a handful of parents who are willing to rotate, or if you can find, people in your community who are willing to be like contractors, that can come in and work with a group of students, in a small environment. Those are fantastic ways to start. You can meet in public places. You can do, hands-on learning where you're taking field trips places, meeting in labs. There's a lot of business spaces that are opening up in communities where people are willing to lend business space out, maybe at a reduced rate. So I would encourage you to check within your community to find out what is available in that regard as well. So that's kind of the key starting point there. Once you maybe have gotten beyond that and you feel comfortable with, the fact that there is something lined up, whether you're spearheading it or you find something else that currently exists, is the withdrawal process. And I know that there's always a lot of questions and concerns about what it takes to withdraw from the public school system. I would highly recommend, there are a number of online sources. The Indiana Association of Homeschool Educators is a great resource that provides a lot of information and resources to families who are looking at alternatives, obviously specifically homeschool. I don't know how much they'd be able to tell you about like charters or private schools, but you can find all kinds of information out there with that as well. The key thing that I would say about homeschooling that's nice is that you don't have to have accreditation. So if you're looking at creating some system out there, that can be a challenge, especially if you're looking at wanting to take funds from places. But homeschool, to my knowledge, doesn't require any accreditation or anything along those lines. It's pretty loosely defined in terms of what type of education you need to be providing in terms of like documentation and things of that nature. So you can definitely check out their website and reach out to them online. Use each other as resources as well. There are lots of people out there that have been homeschooling for multiple generations, that have multiple kids that they're homeschooling. They can provide a lot of great feedback and information about what that looks like there. So that's kind of my advice as far as that end goes. If you're really ready to pull the trigger and get your kids out of public school and, look for something or find something and then go pull the trigger to get them out. Those are kind of the steps, just depending upon where you're at on that spectrum in terms of really being ready to move on from your local public school. The other thing that I wanted to mention as well with this, and this is kind of more of, the crossover then into, how more specifically, as an organization, whether you're a part of a group like Purple for Parents or some other local Facebook group or organization, the one caveat or red flag that I really want to throw out here is, I think that within this movement of parents, yes, obviously this transcends the political spectrum. There are, people who are, identifying Democrats, maybe moderate, maybe even left leaning, who are upset and frustrated. They're probably in the minority. I would say a majority of people who are in this movement identify as Republicans, conservatives. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed here with this. It's clearly there. I think we see the dividing lines being drawn in between right, left, conservative, Democrat, Republican, so on and so forth. But the caveat that I want to throw out here to this, and I would love to generate some discussion on this as well, because I don't see this being discussed enough within our groups of concerned parents that are out there, again, regardless of political affiliation, whether you identify as independent, Republican, maybe even libertarian minded, is this. I think we need to be very careful that we don't fall into the trap of advocating for the government to act and do things that we want to see happen. I think that is a huge mistake that I see a lot in the messaging, that I see a lot in the ideology that's coming from concerned parent groups and people who are saying, for example, calling for a ban on things. I think is somewhat of a misplaced thought or action or energy. Because what are we doing? We're calling for the government to do something. And I think that at the end of the day, if we are reassessing what we believe in and what we hold as true, we really believe in limited government, right? I mean, that's really what we probably have as kind of our core tenets here. Again, regardless of whether you're dyed in the wool red Republican or you lean more libertarian, social versus fiscal policies. I know that all those things factor into it, but by and large, what we should be adhering to is the idea of limited government. And so I think it's counterintuitive to say that we want to use the government to accomplish these goals. What we should be advocating for is the removal of government from making these decisions and having a role in what we as individual citizens, as family members, community members, empowering ourselves to be able to make those decisions on our own. And so I just want to caution to not fall into that trap. And I do think it is a trap, because then I think you're playing the same game that the other side is playing. You just want the outcome that you want. And that's dangerous, in my opinion, because, again, what you're doing is you're empowering the government to make decisions that you agree with at this point, but that you may not agree with at some other point. But then you have to be honest with yourself and say, well, yeah, I was all for the government intervening on this and in this way, but now all of a sudden I'm not. And that's a difficult position, I believe, to defend, as opposed to being consistent, which is just to say, I don't want government making that decision at all. I want the freedom and ability to be able to make that choice, whatever that is, right? Whether you're talking mask mandates, quarantines, or just more broadly, how you educate your child, and so on and so forth. And so, again, even when you're playing within the context of the government, run school system, you should be advocating for removing government action wherever you can and letting the market choose, and the market in this case being us as families, as citizens, what that should look like. And again, I was listening this morning to the radio, and I heard, Rob Kendall on 93 WIBC talking about Todd Young, and this kind of sparked this idea in my mind of, here's a guy who's out there saying, he's listening to people in communities talk about the influence of inflation in their lives and having a hard time hiring people for businesses. And, Rob's absolutely right to point out that Senator Young and other Republicans are guilty of advocating for a lot of the policies that have caused this mess, right? And so that's another example of how we can't, get in front of the microphones and say, hey, we're all for the government doing all of these things, so long as we think that it's the okay outcome or the thing that we want. But then when they use it to do something we don't want, again, we have a difficult, position to defend, to say, well, but in this case, we don't want you to do that, right? And that, can create some inconsistencies there. So, again, I think that kind of ties into my message from earlier this week in saying what should be done. Well, what should be done is we should be given the freedom to choose what we find best as the option for educating our children. And how we do that, I explain that here today, giving some hopefully inspiration into things that you can look into, community, events that you can look for, brainstorm with each other, get together, face to face, talk things out, get the planning stages going, decide who can do what, and see if it grows into anything. And if there's enough demand for it, it should. If there are enough people within a community, town, county, region, whatever, who are fed up, truly fed up to the point where they want to withdraw from this situation, then the demand will be there, and then the supply comes, right? Then you start to supply the solutions to what you have there. And so, at any rate, hopefully that helps. Because, like I said, I saw a lot of people say, hey, I'm at that point where I'm ready to act, but I just don't know what to do next. I don't know where to go or who to turn to. Use each other, and find somebody that can help kind of spearhead the operation. And hopefully you'll find opportunities that will arise for the right solutions to be met for you and your situation. So again, resist using government as the platform to achieve what we want. That's not what we're advocating for. It shouldn't be if we're being consistent in our thinking. Go out there and find something that I think once you find you create something on your own too, it feels a lot better, and it probably will have better results than if we rely on the government and its institutions to try to provide for us. So, all right, have a great rest of the week. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week. Thanks. Have a good one.